Hi, everybody. My name is Julie Fei-Fan Balzer, and this is Book Club. So, in case you have never been to Book Club, a couple of things that you ought to know. Basically, each month there's a book. This month it happens to be Matisse on art. You can see all my little notes. This is more of a philosophical book. We often do sort of books that are a little more practical. So, actually, next month we're going to be doing Watercolors for Everyone, which is a little bit more of a kind of like how-to book with lessons and steps and stuff that you can do. So a couple other things to get out of the way before we get started. If you want to know about all the different things that I offer, you can visit me at juliebalzer.com and learn about the different classes and stuff like that. And of course, I hope that we can connect on Instagram where you can see all the kind of artwork I do. I post lots of art tips and tutorials there too. So you can check all of that out. Okay, so welcome. And I guess the first question is, who read the book? Who here actually read the book? So I'm going to make a complete confession. I didn't make it all the way through. Not because it isn't a good book. It is, but I underestimated the amount of time I was going to need to get through here. And my son was not cooperating. He has not been sleeping through the night for the past week or two. So there you go. Tanny says that she's halfway through. Tanny and I are on the same page. Well, maybe not the literal same page, but here's the thing. This is a more academic book than I kind of expected. There's like a 28-page introduction that's definitely written in a sort of academic prose. It's interesting and it's good. And Jack Flam, who wrote this, is obviously a Matisse scholar, but it's one of those things where I actually had to look up a couple words, and I consider myself to be a fairly educated person, but I wanted to make sure that I actually understood what he was talking about. That said, if you read just the introduction to this book, you still get, I think, an enormous amount of content for the book. Now, here's the thing that really excites me, which is when Matisse actually does his own writing, he's a wonderful writer, and it's so clear. His notes to a young painter are absolutely fabulous, and I have highlighted and flagged, obviously, a lot of stuff. So let's go ahead and dive in. So I did put together a quick slideshow of some Matisse images that I just, stole from online. And you can see, if you're not familiar with his work, sort of a little bit of the kind of stuff that he does. Okay, so I'm going to make this. I don't think I can make it any bigger. Okay, so there it is. Okay, so obviously one of the things that people said about Matisse's work when it first came out is that it was really ugly, because they were used to sort of realism, right? So I don't know if you find this ugly. I find it beautiful, but I think time has certainly softened things, so that definitely does help. But Matisse says several times in this book that one of his major objects was really to simplify. He was interested in simplifying the human figure, and I'm hoping that I can lay my hands now on this one beautiful quote from him that explains a lot about his goals. Let's see if I can. I should have marked my flags a little bit better. Here you go. Okay. I think this is it. Okay. So he says here that, so this is a quote from him in some of his writing. He says, "I know that I must give it something more. I will condense the meaning of this body by seeking its essential line. The charm will be less apparent at first glance, but it must eventually emerge from the new image I have obtained, which will have a broader meaning, one fully human." So the idea here is that instead of painting what, is like a realistic version of what he sees, he's sort of painting his emotion and what he feels and getting at the essentials, the simple lines of this person. And that's one of the things that I have always loved about Matisse, is those simple lines that you really can see in his work. I think people may be very familiar with some of his cutouts, which is what this is. This is cut paper. It's collage, where what he has done, you can see, is cut the very simplest of forms to create this absolutely beautiful body. And he has a whole series of these. I was lucky enough to see some of them in person. If you ever get a chance to see a Matisse exhibit, I suggest you go. Most museums have a Matisse or two around because he was a very prolific. So you can see he went through a period where he was painting a lot of these sort of draperies and interesting other pieces, this kind of Moroccan-inspired stuff. He really traveled a lot, and he writes in the book quite a bit about kind of the importance of traveling. And I think that that is something especially right now with COVID and the pandemic and being stuck at home, when I read his words about traveling and how getting away from home made him see home more clearly, seeing the light in another place made him see the light in his studio differently. I was reminded how much sort of the sameness of our everyday pandemic life is actually really stifling, at least to my artistic experience. And so, I think everybody sort of has been trying to get out into nature more now that we're at home and we don't travel as much and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's hugely important. Matisse really emphasizes nature a lot in his work. Okay, so let me just get to some of the things that I love the most from here. Because I think they're really, really good. So this is from the author talking about sort of what he thinks as a Matisse scholar, is sort of like what Matisse was going after. So it says, he pursued many of the same goals throughout his life, working out different ways to achieve them. The major themes are self-expression, freedom from formulas, reliance on direct experience and intuition, the use of simple means, and an awareness of working within a tradition. 5 things. The writings reflect his conviction that art is a means of projecting the self's encounter with the world through imagery and activity grounded in contemplation that serves as a kind of private religion. The artist develops his art by developing himself. So there is so much in that tiny little bit. So let's pick it apart for a second because I think it's important. And feel free to chime in if you have a totally different opinion than me, or if you agree, or if you don't. Let's have a conversation about it. After all, isn't that what book club's about? Okay. So 1, self-expression. I think this is so interesting. So one of the things that Matisse talks a lot about in the writings in this book is about how he sort of began his career trying to paint as painters were taught, kind of like serious realism and all that kind of stuff. But he felt sort of like unhappy and stifled in it. He didn't like his work. And so it wasn't until he started to paint how things made him feel that he really found sort of who he was as an artist. And so I think that he had a school, by the way, and one of the things he talks about that he's really trying to teach people in the school is not how to paint like him, not how to paint by a formula, not how to paint any of this, but to like boil down to who they are. And this, I think, is my favorite thing, which would be the advice that I would give to any student of mine, which is, he said, go back to your early work. That's how he found his style. And look at the things that you see that are sort of similar across it. Like that, boiled down, stripping away anything else. That is the essentials of what your style is. And I thought that was interesting because certainly at the very beginning, all of us work from kind of instinct and just doing what feels natural. And then it's like, as we learn more, we start to let sort of other people's ideas creep into what we do. And so I think it's really exciting to think of, doing something, looking at your old work in order to be able to find what really are your instincts and stuff. Okay. The next thing that he says here is freedom from formulas. So he talks a lot about how, like, if formulas worked, basically everyone would be a master, right? And that the only formula you can have is a formula that you come up with yourself. So I teach this class called Boot Camp, which is all about teaching the design elements and principles. And that's, people think of it as kind of like a formula, but really what the design elements and principles are, and this is what I tell my students all the time, is these are kind of ideas or rules that people come up with, but then you need to decide for yourself what is balanced to you. Not to my eye, not to the person next to you, not to what strangers say on the internet, but like, what does it mean to you? And I think that is the clearest part of developing your artistic voice. And now I feel very buttressed by the fact that Matisse says the same thing. You have to have your own like ideas and standards and formulas. It can't be somebody else's. And actually, he talks a lot about interesting relativity of, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to talk about it, but let's just go down this list a little bit further. So he says reliance on direct experience and intuition. And by that, Matisse said, I'll see if I can paraphrase this correctly. In an ideal situation, he would have a 3-level studio. And on the first level, he would paint from life, from nature, from like a model, an actual still life, whatever it is. But then on the second level, he would like come down to look at the model, but then go back up and sort of use his memory, come back down and then go back up, come back down and then go back up. And what would happen then is that he would then at the third level work purely from memory or imagination. And I think that's really interesting. There's a quote where he talks about how he was trying to capture the lace in a painting, a lace collar. And he drew it perfectly over and over and over and over until he could get all the details. And then when he absolutely knew that he had it perfectly, he began to simplify, 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 simplify until he was able to create this lace collar that was really just like 2 or 3 gestures, you know, shoop, shoop, shoop. And he felt that it represented that perfectly because he was now doing it from memory of what it was as much more than the reality, but sort of the essence of it. And if you look at these figures here, you can see that they are simplified down, right, to the very essence of, you can tell that it's a person. Does it matter that there aren't features? You know what I mean? You can even tell, you could get into the positions that they are standing or sitting in very easily because it absolutely is a person. And I think that this is one of the things when people start to draw, they have this idea that they have to paint, you know, beautiful, perfect, you know, completely photorealistic. And one of the things that Matisse says several times in this book is he talks about how with photography, you do not need to paint realistically. Photography does it quicker and better than you ever could. Your job is to express yourself, to share sort of what you feel. Okay. Then the next thing he says is the use of simple means. Obviously, as we've mentioned before, he's simplifying everything way down to its essential forms. He has these wonderful ink drawings, as you can see here. And I do remember trying to recreate one of his ink drawings because it really looks like it's like 5 lines, right? It really looks like it's 5 lines, but it's very hard to get the right 5 lines. And I think that is why you see Matisse goes through his drafts and drafts and drafts and drafts and drafts of work to get it down to its very essential nature. You know, he has a great quote where he says, like, anything that isn't useful to the picture, right, is a distraction. And it's like, can you imagine this without the single eyelash? Can you imagine this, you know what I mean, without the curve of the neck being exactly as it is? What would happen if it were straight? What would happen? I mean, everything seems essential to making the drawing come together. And then the last thing he says is an awareness of working within a tradition. So people were apparently always shocked when they went to his school and discovered that he wanted them to do basically what people have done for years when they were learning how to make art, that he wanted them to learn how to like paint realistically, to draw realistically, to copy the masters, to do all those kinds of things, because they didn't think that that's the kind of stuff he did. It didn't seem like he was doing that, but he really was grounded in like a real history of art, of artistic traditions, of knowing what came before you, of all that kind of stuff. And I think that's a philosophy that I personally agree with too. You should know what's out there so that you can know, you know, what you are taking and leaving, essentially. And then the last statement he said here is, he said, the artist develops his art by developing himself. And I think so often we think that the only time that you are working on making art is when you're like in the studio painting, drawing, collaging, sewing, whatever it is that you do to make art. But in fact, I think the truth of the matter is, as you think about things, as you read a book, as you listen to someone talk about a book, as you go on a trip, as you look at a leaf, at whatever it is, like as you develop your curiosity, your mind, yourself, like that is you becoming an artist, because you cannot separate yourself from your art. That is Matisse's theory. And it's something that I think I agree with too, which is, you know, who you are, the things you've been through, that's part of what makes you the artist that you are. You couldn't be any other artist. You know, you could only be you. And so that's something that you should celebrate. Okay, enough philosophizing. Let's go a little bit for a second through some of the other things I really like here. So one of the things that I flagged, one of the 100 billion things that I flagged here, is that they talk a lot in the book about color and how important Matisse's color sense is. And one of my sadnesses is that all the reproductions in the book are black and white. So you can't really see any of the color. So if you're not familiar with Matisse's work and you're reading this book, I really think that you should go ahead and take a look at some of his pictures online or in a museum, because they're really wonderful. By the way, doesn't this face look so simple to draw? I challenge you, take out a pen right now or a marker and see if you can draw exactly what you see here. It's really hard. It's really hard. I tried. Okay. So here is the thing that I said earlier. He says, I discovered myself by considering at first my earliest works. They rarely deceive. There I found something that was always the same and which at first glance I thought to be a monotonous repetition in my pictures. It was the manifestation of my personality, which appeared the same no matter what different states of mind I passed through. So that is, again, about getting back to the mind of a beginner. I also wanted to show just really quickly this picture, even though it's in black and white, from the book. Right here. So this is the photograph that he was working from. And this way, this is his painting. And you can see why people called his work monstrous, because it doesn't necessarily look like her, but like it is a monumental version, right, of a woman. Is it her essence? Is it something about her he's capturing? Is it something he's saying? Is it his emotional reaction to her? And to me, like, that's sort of where art comes in, which is that it really does, sort of express who you are. And as Tam was saying, as a teenager, he made very realistic portraits. That's 100% true. If you look through a lot of his earlier work, he started as many artists do. Picasso painted, completely realistically. A lot of great artists start by learning the fundamentals and really getting them down and then moving on to sort of doing what their own style is. And he actually talks about that. He talks about how you have to be a beginner. I run into a lot of students in my classes who want to sort of fast forward to the end. And I get it. I want to fast forward to the end. Everybody does, right? But the thing is, you can't really get there until you get through all of it. You need to know your color theory. You need to know all your design fundamentals. You need to actually like have a grasp of your tools and how they work. And so when you want to start creating original art, it's because you've learned all those fundamentals. And I think people get attracted to kind of like sexy notions of like, you're going to end up with this beautiful finished thing after 2 hours. And that's great. More power to you. But I think your time is better spent, this is what I believe, doing the time of doing the fundamentals, of the learning, of the experiential learning, of figuring things out and really learning the basics and the fundamentals. You got to walk before you can run. Okay. So, this is another thing that I liked here from his book, which is, he says, composition, the aim of which should be expression, is modified according to the surface to be covered. If I take a sheet of paper of a given size, my drawing will have a necessary relationship to its format. I could not repeat this drawing on another sheet of different proportions, for example, rectangular instead of square, nor should I be satisfied with a mere enlargement had I to transfer the drawing to a sheet the same shape but 10 times larger. A drawing must have an expansive force which gives life to the things around it. An artist who wants to transpose a composition from one canvas to another larger one must conceive it anew in order to preserve its expression. He must alter its character and not just square it up onto the larger canvas. So I think there's this sort of theory sometimes that people have that you can just like draw in your sketchbook and then size it up and it's totally done and fine. But the fact of the matter, and I happen to agree with Matisse, is that like it is different to paint something enormous than to paint something small, just like the way that the colors move, the way that things react. And so he really did full-size sketches of these huge pieces in order to get what he wanted right. And I think that's really cool and exciting, and it makes me think a lot about it. Okay. So then the next thing he said here was, he says, let's see if I can get this quite on the page where I want it to be. Okay. He says that this is about the rules thing that we talked about. So rules have no existence outside of individuals. Otherwise, a good professor would be as great a genius as Racine. Any one of us is capable of repeating fine maxims, but few can also penetrate their meaning. I think that's kind of exciting. I am ready to admit this. From a study of the works of Raphael or Titian, a more complete set of rules can be drawn than from the works of Manet or Renoir. But the rules followed by Manet and Renoir were those which suited their temperaments, and I prefer the most minor of their paintings to all the work of those who are content to imitate the Venus of Urbino or the Madonna of the Goldfinch. The latter are of no value to anyone, for whether we want to or not, we belong to our time, and we share in its opinions, its feelings, even its delusions. All artists bear the imprint of their time, but the great artists are those in whom this is most profoundly marked. Okay, So there are a lot of things that I find interesting there, but most I want to emphasize the idea that like we all have our individual set of rules that follow our temperaments, and we all are products of our time. And I think like this idea of sort of being timeless or that, is ridiculous. We fit into sort of the modes, the pop culture icons, the whatever it is sort of like from right now. And just as a side note, this is a painting that I've seen many times at MoMA and always loved the way that the background wraps around her. It's a real, self-expression, I think. And again, it makes me think like, did the background actually wrap around her? I have no idea. Was there a curtain? Did her robe blend into the background? I don't know. It's meaningless to me because in the end, what I see is that I'm seeing something that the painter's seeing. There's a quote that Matisse once gave when someone asked why he painted blue tomatoes. And he said, because that's how I see them. I can't help it if other people don't. And I think that's exciting, right? Why do you paint? Why do you collage? Why do you quilt? Why do you make things? You make things to try to, or at least I do, I'll speak in an I statement here. I make things to try to share what I see about the world, and this is what he sees right in this moment right here. I think it's really exciting. Okay. And again, here he says, in my view, the artist should not represent nature as it is in reality. We have photography for that. We do. It's true. This is something. So I'm teaching a sketchbook class right now. And this is something I keep saying to people over and over again, which is, you can, draw anything you want, but you're not a camera. You're not a camera. So your drawing doesn't have to look completely realistic. It should express who you are, the story you're trying to tell, all that kind of stuff. I think it's really important not to feel like you're a camera. You're not a camera. Okay, so you are representing the model or any other subject, not copying it. There can be no color relations between it and your picture. It is the relation between the colors in your picture, which are the equivalent of the relation between the colors in your model that must be considered. So that's so interesting, right? You're not copying the colors that you see, you're copying the relationships that you see. And that's how you can get, all these very different than you would expect colors and ideas. He's very famous for, I think I included it in this slideshow. Oh, here's an early self-portrait that he did, which actually tends to slightly more realistic, I suppose. But, he's very famous. There's a woman with a green stripe down the center of her face. And that was a very famous painting he did but that's really about the color relationships. Did she actually have a green stripe down her face? No, but that's what he saw in terms of what else was there. Okay. Then there's, by the way, if you read just one small section of this, do read Notes to a Painter. It's really good. So this says, again, he should not copy the walls or objects on a table, but he should above all express a vision of color, the harmony of which corresponds to his feeling. And above all, one must be honest with oneself. I never work from a previous sketch or study, but from memory. I now draw with feeling and not anatomically. I know how to draw correctly, having studied form for so long, right? You can step away from reality when you know sort of how it works. I love this piece. This is something that I love that he says. He's talking about drawings that he has in his studio, and he says, yes, that drawing is bad, but I keep it all the same because I may be able to learn from it someday just because I failed. I've always said you learn more from your failures than your successes, and it's really important to keep your old work. I know a lot of people feel a desire to throw it away and kind of get rid of it. But I think that it's important to remember sort of where you came from, to understand why you failed or why it didn't work out. And you really can only see that when you're able to look back at that old stuff. So I think it's good. I see that Andrew says he once took a college level life drawing class and was embarrassed that his drawings came out blocky. And I think that it's one of those things where we all have this idea of how our artwork should work instead of embracing sort of what our artwork is. Yes, you can learn to draw better and you can learn to draw, correctly, and you can learn to do all those things, but then you should pay attention to sort of what your instincts are. Is there something about that blocky form that you like? Is there something about the sculptural way of putting things together? And I like that about Matisse, that he's really interested in people figuring out sort of who they really are. And going with that. Okay, this seemed like I'd love to know what Matisse thinks of the internet. Because he talks in here about sort of copying others and about like being influenced by others. And you see, so he talks about Cézanne, and he says, Cézanne, you see, is sort of a god of painting. Dangerous, his influence, so what? Too bad for those without the strength to survive it. Not to be strong enough to withstand an influence without weakening is proof of impotence. I will repeat what I said once before. I believe the artist's personality affirms itself by the struggle he has survived. One would have to be very foolish not to notice the direction in which others work. And I think that that's a lot of times people say, like, I'm worried that I'm copying, or am I copying if I look at other people's stuff or any of that kind of stuff. And I think that the thing is, like, you should look at what other people are doing. It's good to be aware of what other people are doing. I think that's important. The trick is to not let yourself be swayed into doing what they're doing, but to like learn, what can you learn from them? And then keeping true to sort of who you are and things that you like to do, you know, what interests you. And I think Matisse and his simplicity of line, even in some of his very complicated pieces, it's still incredibly simple. You know, that's what he's interested in and how he's expressing himself. Okay. This is another thing that I thought was interesting, which I think I talked about this a little earlier. He says, I nowadays want a certain formal perfection, and I work by concentrating my means to give my painting this quality, which is perhaps external, but which is necessary at a given moment of a well-executed finished object. But this doesn't mean that it isn't necessary to mess up some canvas when you are young, that one shouldn't start at the beginning. So this is an interview he gave when he was in his 50s. And I think the problem is we run into a lot of artists when they're at the middle or the end of their careers, and we think that we should be there too, but you don't know all the time and effort that's gone into it. There's a probably apocryphal Picasso story where he was at a bar and a woman asked him if he would draw something on a cocktail napkin, and he quickly sketched something. And as he slid it back to her, he said, that'll be $30,000. And she said, what? You drew on that for 30 seconds. And he said, no, my dear, 30 years. And I think that story for me has always illustrated the idea, which is, he was able to do that quickly because he had struggled, because he had put the work in, because he had done all that time, and I think it's important to remember it's always okay to be a beginner. It's always okay to be a beginner. Okay. So this is the last little quote that I'm going to read from here. It says, in art, what is most important is the relationship between things. The attempts to possess the light and space in which I lived gave me the desire to see myself with a different space and light, which would allow me to grasp more profoundly the space and light in which I do live, if only to become more conscious of them. Most painters require direct contact with objects in order to feel that they exist, and they can only reproduce them under strictly physical conditions. They look for exterior light to illuminate them internally. Whereas the artist or the poet possesses an interior light, which transforms objects to make a new world of them. Sensitive, organized, a living world, which is in itself an infallible sign of divinity, a reflection of divinity. So I think it's interesting. He says most painters require direct contact with objects, and he makes the difference that the artist possesses, an interior light. So it's really about, are you just copying something that you see, trying to make a photograph of it? And that's great for skill building. I really think it is. Or if that's the kind of art that expresses who you are, rock on. Or are you really sort of thinking about how it is, put together, how it makes you feel? Matisse very famously went through many, many drafts of things, and, often would just completely not retouch a draft, but start a new canvas next to it with the same ideas in order to redo it, because he felt that the retouching of it would sort of muddle up the simplicity of the line. And in many of the interviews in here, what I find so interesting is the people who came to interview him are kind of deeply insulting. They call his work ugly to his face. He was very controversial. At one point at the Art Institute of Chicago, he had an exhibit and students burned an effigy of his work. He was really reviled. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because we think of his painting now as kind of being beautiful and calm and nothing like scandalous or odd about it, right? In fact, so some people say it's only pretty and it doesn't have like great political, meaning or anything like that. But it's so interesting that it was so controversial because he found beauty in non-conventional ways. And I think the reason that I resonate so much with Matisse, and he's long been one of my favorite artists, and that it sort of all confirmed it for me in the reading of this book, really is because he decided that he liked to find a different kind of beauty. And I often have said, I like making interesting faces. I like painting things that are sort of confusing to the brain and a jumble. And a lot of times people will tell me that things are ugly or they don't like the things that I make, or things too much visual stimulation for them, or whatever it is, all those kinds of things. And the thing that I always try to remember and say to myself, and I think it's important for everybody to say it, is that you have to create art that pleases yourself. Right? This is the one, my mom taught me how to drive. I remember we were at a stop sign and she said to me, if you have to wait for an hour at a stop sign, that's fine. Because remember, the person honking behind you, they aren't going to stop if you have an accident. They aren't going to help you when you have to go to the hospital. They aren't going to, deal with your car when it gets smashed up. So don't worry about what someone else behind you is mad at you and they're honking or doing whatever. Leave the stop sign, when you feel ready. And it's kind of a great metaphor for a lot of things in life. And especially I think about making art. In the end of the day, yes, you need people to buy your work if you're trying to make a living. So that is important. But, you can always find your people, your tribe, the people who like the stuff that you do. You don't need to please everybody, right? So you should always please yourself, because at least one person's happy then, and then kind of find the people who resonate with you. I think that is sort of the best advice. And one of the biggest things that I take away from this book really is about, it's okay to see the world with your own eyes. In fact, it's an ideal. The other last thing I just want to mention is several interviewers talk about how charming Matisse was, how well-spoken he was, how he wasn't sort of their idea of a painter with bad teeth and scraggly hair and do you know what I mean? That he was actually a well put together person, very educated, and how some of his critics used to say that the only reason people accepted his paintings was because he was able to talk about them. And I think that's interesting, especially nowadays when we talk so much as artists about marketing yourself and how do you, do all that kind of stuff, that in a funny way, that argument has kind of been around for a really long time. If Matisse was getting leveled with it, right? So Janine says that prior to the pandemic, she had the extreme pleasure to see the permanent collection of Matisse's work at the Baltimore Museum of Art, which houses the largest public collection of his works in the world. Yes. So that is a goal of mine, to make it there to Baltimore to see that. And Janine also says, yeah, I can't worry about what other people think about me or the space I occupy. Yeah, because if you let other people into your brain and into your space, that's really suffocating. And then you just aren't able to be yourself. You can't trust yourself. You can't do any of those things anymore. So that's really hard. Overall, here is my sort of very quick book review. This is a really interesting book. It's thicker, and I don't mean just physically than I thought. It's meatier. There's a lot more to digest than I thought. And I think, I sort of read it. And again, I didn't finish it. But there are 100 pages at the end of notes, index notes, and the original French of some pieces, if you don't like the translations. But what I was going to say is it's very meaty. There's a lot to digest. I think I'm going to be thinking about this book for a while. Of everything in the book, I like Matisse's actual writings the best. He writes very clearly, and I think I'm going to have to read his notes to a painter 3 or 4 times to really just get everything and gather it. I do think it's interesting. The editor, Jack Flam, what he does, he's not a flim-flam. I'm not sure how to pronounce F-L-A-M. Is it flam? Is it flam? He basically writes before every single interview or essay or everything in there, cliff notes. This is what you're going to find in here. So you could actually kind of read through very quickly. It also helps with some of the texts that are a little more obtuse, which I don't know if it's because they are translated from French, or it's just a different style of writing, but they're some of the writing, my eyes were like, what are we talking about? And I had to read a couple sentences a couple times in order to get it. So in that sense, those sort of Cliff Notes things were very helpful. And Tanny says there's so many quotes that are thought-provoking, and she wrote down a ton of them. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here. So overall, I'd say definitely worth it. You can check it out from the library. It's a book. It's been around for a while. This is the revised edition. I also bought it on Amazon, and I think it was fairly inexpensive. I know that our next book, Watercolors for Everyone, I saw it this morning on Amazon, maybe for $12. This one actually is from the library. You can see from the barcode. So you can pick that up, and that is going to be on, let's see, September 15th at 8 p.m. We'll be discussing the book Watercolor is for Everything, or for everything. Watercolor is not for everything, but it is for everyone. So I'm excited to look that up and see how it goes. Also, I do have a live screen printing class. Well, it's live online screen printing class coming up. And that is going to be on September 12th if you're interested. And you can find out more about that at juliebalzer.com. And I think that's basically all I have to share. So I want to say thanks so much to all of you for being here. I hope you enjoy book club. And if you have suggestions for books that you'd like to have us talk about, feel free to send me an email. I'd love to know what you want to talk about. So thanks so much. Bye.